Okay, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Montenegro and the situation with the Orthodox Church. We've done videos in the past dealing with the dissecting and the breakup of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and this has to do with the Orthodox Church remaining a part of the Moscow Patriarch, but then with the changing tides in Ukraine and many political decisions, both taken up by Bartholomew in Constantinople as well as in the halls of D.C. It appears we had a row in the church in Ukraine, leading to a split, which didn't work out too well. Well, it seems that we have something similar, not exactly the same, but once again something similar happening in Montenegro, where we have the church, this time of Serbia. You have a new patriarch who was flown in over the weekend by chopper to take over his new seat as head of the Orthodox Church in Montenegro. And Bishop Jakonice II will be the new metropolitan of Montenegro at the historic monastery of Cetinje. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. And there were a lot of protests, Alexander. A lot of protests. People are very upset. They're very divided and they're very bitter about the breakup of the Orthodox Church. Lavrov even came out with some statements as well before the protests. And I think he phrased it well, where he kind of, and I'm paraphrasing, he looks at this as the West destroying the Orthodox Church. And in my opinion, that is what it appears like. It does appear like the West is destroying the Orthodox Church. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. I'm going to say something. I'm going to go a little bit further than you said. You said that the situation in Montenegro is very similar to that in Ukraine. I think it's almost identical, actually, in that I get the overwhelming sense that this is actually something that has been imported into Montenegro from outside, just as it was into Ukraine. Now, in saying this, I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that there aren't people in Montenegro and in Ukraine who don't want to break away from the Orthodox churches that their countries have up to now belonged to. But I'm pretty sure you would not be seeing protests on this scale in Montenegro and the kind of moves that we saw in Ukraine with the Patriarch of Constantinople playing a role, unless there was pressure on for these events coming from outside, specifically, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, from the United States. Now, in Ukraine, the problem there, or at least the problem as some people saw it, was that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine is closely connected to and integrated with the Russian Orthodox Church. It's not, contrary to what many people think, a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. Exactly. It has always been an autonomous entity within the Russian Orthodox Church, but for some people, any kind of connection to Moscow was unacceptable, and the attempt was therefore made using the Patriarch of Constantinople to sever the link. So that was what happened in Ukraine. In Montenegro, it's even more passionate and difficult, because around a third of the population of Montenegro actually rejects the notion of Montenegro being in any way different or distinct from Serbia. And of course, a lot, when I say a third, I mean a third of the population of Montenegro define themselves not as Montenegrins, and as in other words, as people having a distinct nationality. They define themselves as Serbs. And of course, beyond that, there's an even larger community of people who continue to feel committed to the Orthodox Church. And that is an Orthodox Church that encompasses Serbia and Montenegro, that links the two together. Now, the previous pro-Western, pro-NATO government accordingly began to take steps to break the Orthodox Church in Montenegro to away from Serbia. In other words, it played exactly the same sort of game as the government in Ukraine tried to play. And that provoked its electoral defeat when people in Montenegro rallied to defense of their church. But now we see the installation of the new metropolitan has become a pretext for more protests. This time, supposedly against the church, but also, I think, and it's quite clear to me, if you look at the kind of people who are involved, that this is also a first step towards some kind of colour revolution scenario in Montenegro. And the kind of comments that you heard from Lavrov, he spoke, by the way, on the 30th of August, in other words, a couple of days ago. And he actually said that there are now sustained attempts to break the unity of world orthodoxy. And he said that the Russian Orthodox Church is under tremendous pressure from the United States. So he said that it's the United States that has that goal. And he made it fairly clear that this relates to other places as well. And of course, Montenegro is one. So I suspect that the Russians had intelligence about what was happening or going to happen in Montenegro, and you saw those comments from Lavrov. So this is a very interesting scenario. It's all about the way the United States, or at least certain agencies within the United States, have convinced themselves that the Orthodox Church is some kind of vehicle for Russian influence, which is, by the way, nonsense. I mean, this is a complete misunderstanding of how Orthodoxy works. It's trying to break up the Orthodox Church. It's trying to break it up in Ukraine. It's trying to break it up in Montenegro and Serbia. And it's trying to support nationalist groups. And by the way, some of the people who were protesting in Montenegro were extreme hardline, very far-right nationalists, very much like the sort of people you see in Ukraine, targeting Serbia in the case of Montenegro, targeting Russia in the case of Ukraine. But in both cases, it's a sort of anti-Orthodox policy pursued by the United States or some agencies within the United States that have come to believe that the Orthodox Church and Orthodoxy is some kind of vehicle for Russian and Serb influence, which, as I said, is bonkers. But that's what they obviously believe, and we see how disruptive and damaging that this is on the ground in these countries.
Yeah, you're saying that the U.S. Surveillance state, deep state, neocon neoliberals, NGOs, all these forces kind of view the Orthodox Church as a way to project Russian influence. Could you not say that it's most likely, though, the other way around, that they see the Russian Orthodox Church, or just the Orthodox Church in general, as a vehicle that is blocking their ideology from entering these countries?
Absolutely. And I mean, the two go together because, of course, they've now got this idea that, of course, Russia is the great obstacle to these ideas, to these values, which they are to a great extent. But of course, there is the other side, which is, and I'm going to say it straightforwardly, a very strong anti-Christian element that's now developing. There's these attempts to import and export values around Europe and around the world, certain values which perhaps we shouldn't go into too much detail, but everybody who follows this program knows what we're talking about. Certain ideas that are alien to these societies. We've seen how that's come under resistance in places like Hungary and Poland, which are Catholic Christian countries. Serbia, Montenegro, Ukraine predominantly, and Russia are Orthodox Christian countries. Christian values are still very strong there. In fact, they're extremely strong there. The Orthodox churches in these countries oppose these things or stand against these things. So you want to break them up. You want to break them up and smash them because, from your point of view, it prevents the export of your values. And of course, there's a geopolitical dimension because behind it all, there's Russia. So it all comes together in a really unpleasant combination of things with, frankly, some really unpleasant people involved in these protests. And the protests became, in Montenegro, extremely violent And the riot police had to be called in. And as you said, the Metropolitan, who is after all just a cleric, had to be shipped in by helicopter, which is really quite astonishing. I expect, by the way, that unless the government in Montenegro acts quickly and decisively and very firmly, we're going to see a colour revolution scenario working out there, and the church will be very much the target of that.
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing the political rhetoric coming out. They're politicizing all of this, the various parties. I mean, I'm on the Balkan Insight website, and it says Montenegro opposition accused of coup attempt over Cetinje riots. And this literally came out just a couple of hours ago, and it says government officials have accused the main opposition party of attempting a coup during the weekend's violent protests against the enthronement of a new Serbian Orthodox Church leader in the country. And that opposition party is the Democratic Party of Socialists, or the DPS. So, I mean, you're already starting to hear the coup, color revolution, division rhetoric starting to play out. I mean, this is politicized now in a big way.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly politicized. By the way, I should say that party, the Democratic Party of Socialists, is the legatee party of the former Communist Party in Montenegro. They continued to remain the government after Yugoslavia broke up. But of course, they then went full spectrum change. They aligned with the US, NATO, the European Union. They turned completely against Serbia, Yugoslavia, Russia, and all the rest, which is, by the way, absolutely typical of former communist parties across Eastern Europe. In Hungary, the former Communist Party, which now calls itself the Socialist Party, leads the opposition to Orban and is in alliance with the Jobbik Party, which is far right. So you see exactly the same sort of policies playing out in Montenegro. I think, as I said, coup attempt. I think a colour revolution attempt, definitely. I don't think it quite worked, by the way. I think they didn't get quite as much support as they expected. And importantly, the police and the security forces didn't go over to their side, which perhaps they also expected. So I think that this one failed, and that gives the government an opportunity in Montenegro to go out and sort of stabilise the situation and maintain control there. But, of course, it's only the first attempt. I'm pretty sure that there's going to be others over the next few weeks and months. And bear something in mind. The US can't afford, and the EU can't afford to, as they would say, lose Montenegro. And whilst there's no particular call at the moment in Montenegro for Montenegro to sort of change its alignments with the US and the EU, if there's more pressure, that might change. And if that happens, then, so soon after Montenegro has joined NATO, and it looks as if it might start to shift away, well, that is intolerable. And you will see ever more fierce attempts to try to change the position, to try to change the government there. So, I think we're at the beginning of a very deep and very intense political struggle and conflict in Montenegro.
Yeah, but where does it lead? Can you just get into the sides involved here? I mean, you mentioned the EU. We've mentioned the US, there's Serbia, and then there's the, for lack of a better word, I guess we call it the nationalist Montenegro forces as well, forces in Montenegro. Where are the battle lines being drawn for the color revolution that you see?
Well, I don't think that these forces, they're called nationalists. I don't think they're really nationalists. I think what we see, and this is the way I see it, is a concerted attempt by the Brussels Combine. Remember, NATO is also headquartered in Brussels, as is, of course, the European Union. So, that's where the sort of, the immediate base is. I see that there's now a major concerted attempt to push back on all the sort of rebel eastern states. So we've seen a major push against Poland using the court decisions there, and we saw that that was partially effective, and now they're increasing the pressure on Poland. We see major pressure on Hungary with the elections coming up in April there, and with this cobbled together coalition of supposedly left-wing social democrats and the, well, neo-fascist Jobbik party in Hungary, and that increasingly looks like a major attempt to oust Orban. And we see the same thing going on in Montenegro with this patched up coalition of socialists and the real far right targeting the more sovereigntist, nationalist, socially conservative Christian groups and parties in Montenegro, which are the majority, which are aligned with Serbia to some extent, and with Russia also to some extent, but who are also resisting the Brussels Combine's attempts to impose upon them certain geopolitical choices, but also who seek to undermine their values and their resistance to the kind of values that the Brussels Combine seeks to impose. So I think this is all part of a continuum. I think, as I said, we're seeing the Brussels centre engaging in a concerted strike against the sort of rebels, the social conservative Christian rebel leaders in Poland, Hungary, now in Montenegro, on their periphery. And we'll see whether they succeed. They've gained some traction in Poland. The government there didn't prove particularly strong, and we discussed that in a recent video. They're up against a far tougher battle in Hungary, and at the moment, the situation in Montenegro looks extremely evenly balanced, and one can't predict with any confidence how it's all going to turn out.
We mentioned at the beginning of the video how closely this resembles Ukraine. In Ukraine, you could definitely say that they did succeed in tearing apart the Orthodox Church to a certain extent. A lot of it has failed as well. Internally, that new church has also just had a ton of infighting, and the new church has kind of broken up as well, this new entity that they created. But they did succeed to a certain extent in breaking up the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, at least breaking it away from the influence of Moscow. Do you think they will succeed in Montenegro? Because they're relentless. And it is to note that much of what happened in Ukraine did get the backing, succeeded because it got the backing of Constantinople, of the patriarch there, as well as, I have to say, the Greek Orthodox Church and much of the Orthodox churches in the United States.
I think the cards they have to play in Montenegro are very strong. I think that the pressure on Montenegro is going to be huge. And whilst I'm not going to say that the church and its position in Montenegro is definitely going to fail, I would have thought that Montenegro, of all places, is going to be particularly vulnerable to this kind of pressure. Remember, the country is small. It's already part of the Euro-Atlanticist structures and institutions. They have many instruments to play there. And as you rightly say, arguably, if things get really tough, they can bring Constantinople and perhaps parts of the Greek church on side too. So I would have thought that it's going to, that the advantages are very much stacked on their side. The only thing that I think prevents this is actually, firstly, that the church in Montenegro actually looks, for the moment, pretty united and solid. And secondly, that, there's the sentiments of the people who have shown up to now that they're willing to protect their church because they see the church, obviously, as very much part of their identity, which is under attack from all kinds of things. So, it's not definite that they're going to succeed, but I would have thought that the advantage lies with them. We'll just have to wait and see. By the way, I completely agree with you about Ukraine. I mean, in terms of setting up a rival church in Ukraine, the venture has essentially failed. I mean, the church system that they created was simply not a viable one. But in terms of damaging the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, well, I have to say that was partially successful. And of course, it's also promoted the overall strategy of dividing Orthodoxy. I mean, the Patriarch of Constantinople is now clearly aligned with the US, as is part of the Greek Church, and is, of course, part of the Church in the US itself. So, you can't say that the strategy overall has failed, even if they didn't get all that they wanted in Ukraine. And, of course, in Montenegro, on the face of it, their position is stronger. But we will see how it plays out over the next few weeks and months. As I said, they've lost the first round, but they're not going to give up. Absolutely, they're going to come back. And, in Montenegro, of all places, I'd have thought that they have many cards to play.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my final question. You kind of answered it. Is a more broad question in that even though Montenegro, for now, the first round seems to have failed this color revolution, in Ukraine, it succeeded in breaking up the church to a certain extent. But the structure that came out of that breakup, this new entity, was a complete disaster. It has no foundation. How is it going to succeed? But maybe that's not the point. And the point is really about destroying the Orthodox Church. Once again, you destroy it in order to inject the Orthodox people with the ideology that we see playing out now in the West, in Western Europe, and in the West in general, which is we all live it. We all live this. We see it every day. We report on this ideology every day. And that's the goal. And it seems that they are succeeding to a certain extent in breaking up the Orthodox Church. I mean, I remember when we did videos on this Ukraine, back when we were covering this story, we did say that the damage they've done to the Orthodox Church is going to take decades to repair. The Orthodox Church is, for all intents and purposes, the unity of the Orthodox Church has been destroyed for all intents and purposes, and now it's going to have a tremendous effect on the people.
I completely agree. I mean, I think there is the geopolitical agenda, but there's also the values-driven agenda. And on the second, I have to say straightforwardly, they're winning, at least not everywhere, not in every place. But in some places, like, the Western Balkans, I'd say they're definitely winning. The Orthodox Church looks weaker there. The Orthodox Church is not organized, has not organized itself to take on this. This is something that they were not prepared for and not ready to fight against. And they've been, as a result, losing ground. They're losing ground in Montenegro. I believe they're losing ground in Moldova as well, because they're not really ready to cope with this kind of values-driven ideology that we've seen exported to these sort of places. Ultimately, I suspect that there will be a swing against that ideology too. But whether the Orthodox Church will be there to take advantage of it, what kind of state it will be in at the end of it is, just remains to be seen. It's a kind of attack which I don't think the Orthodox Church has ever had to face before. And I don't think, they've really worked out a plan of how to respond to it well. Maybe they will, but at the moment, they're entirely on the defensive against an adversary that isn't going to go away and just keeps attacking.
Yeah, it's a worrying situation, but well, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see how this goes along. There has been a lot of damage that has been done, that's for sure. All right, we'll leave it there, guys. Go to the Duran.locals.com and check us out there. We're putting all kinds of great content on there. Not only ourselves, but the entire community. Go to the Duran shop. Use the code RealNews, get 10% off. And ODYSEE, BitChute, Super U, and what else? ODYSEE, BitChute, and Rumble.
And Rumble.
You'll find all our videos there. Take care.